My name is Wendy Lawson. I'm 47 years old. At 9:16 on the morning before my father's funeral, my brother stood inside Miller's Auto Repair with my dad's truck title folded in his coat pocket and told the mechanic, "Just give me the keys. I've already got a buyer waiting." Dad had been gone for 5 days. 5 days. His obituary had not even run in the Sunday paper yet. The church ladies were still calling my mother's friends to organize casseroles. I still had the funeral program open on my laptop with a blank space where I could not make myself choose the final photo. The suit he would be buried in was hanging in the guest room, brushed and ready, with his favorite blue tie draped over the hanger. And my brother Kevin was trying to sell Dad's truck. Not a fancy truck. Not some collectible classic people fight over in estate stories. A 1998 Ford F-150, dark green, long bed, manual locks, cracked dashboard, one dent above the rear wheel, and a faint smell of motor oil, sawdust, peppermint gum, and Dad. It had 212,000 miles on it, and a driver's seat worn smooth on the left edge where Dad slid in and out for 26 years. To anyone else, it was an old truck. To Dad, it was history. He drove it to work every morning when he still had the hardware store. He used it to haul lumber, mulch, fishing gear, appliances for neighbors, boxes when I moved after my divorce, and the old oak dresser my daughter wanted from his attic. He taught me to drive stick in that truck in the high school parking lot on Sundays, laughing when I stalled out and saying, "Easy, Wendy. Machines don't like panic." That truck had carried half our family life in its bed, and Kevin wanted cash before Dad was even in the ground. I was not supposed to be at Miller's that morning. I had gone there because Dad's mechanic, Tom Miller, called me at 8:42 and said, "Wendy, I need you to come down here if you can." His voice was careful. Tom had owned Miller's Auto Repair for 30 years. His shop sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, red brick, 2 service bays, old coffee machine in the office, and a bell on the door that sounded tired every time someone walked in. Dad trusted Tom more than most doctors. When Dad got sick, he kept taking the truck there, not because it needed constant repairs, but because Tom knew how to talk to him without pity. I was at the kitchen table surrounded by funeral notes when Tom called. "What's wrong?" I asked. There was a pause. "Kevin's here about your dad's truck." My hand tightened around the phone. "What about it?" "He says he's selling it." I closed my eyes. Of course he is. I told him I couldn't release the keys. "Why?" "Because your dad left instructions." That sentence stopped me. "What instructions?" Tom's voice softened. "Better you hear them here." So I drove through town under a gray November sky, past houses with wet leaves gathered in gutters, past the church where Dad's funeral would happen the next morning, past the hardware store that still had Lawson Supply faintly visible beneath the new owner's sign. When I walked into Miller's, the bell rang. Kevin turned around. He was wearing a black wool coat, dark jeans, and the impatient expression he always wore when people refused to recognize his urgency as authority. "Wendy," he said, "what are you doing here?" I looked at him. "Funny, I was going to ask you the same thing." His jaw tightened. Tom stood behind the counter, grease still under his fingernails, holding Dad's keyring in one hand. The keyring had a small brass fish attached to it. "I gave that to Dad when I was 12 after winning it at a church rummage sale. He kept it for 35 years. Kevin pointed at the keys. "Tom, this is ridiculous. Dad's gone." "The truck belongs to the estate. I'm handling it." "You are not handling anything," I said. Kevin gave a short laugh. "You've been handling the funeral. I'm handling practical matters." Practical matters. That was what he called greed when he wanted it to sound mature. Tom said quietly, "Kevin, I told you. I'm not releasing the truck to you." Kevin slapped his palm on the counter. "It's not yours." "No," Tom said, "it's not." The shop went still. Not silent. The air compressor kicked on in the back. A radio played low in one of the bays. Rain tapped the window. But the three of us stood inside something heavier than sound. Tom reached under the counter and pulled out a manila envelope. On the front, in Dad's handwriting, were 3 words. "For Wendy only." My knees nearly gave out. Kevin stared at it. "What the hell is that?" Tom looked at him. Your father gave it to me 6 weeks ago." Kevin's face reddened. "He was sick 6 weeks ago." "He was clear 6 weeks ago," Tom said. I reached for the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter, a copy of the truck title, a service invoice, and a handwritten note clipped to a spare key. I unfolded the letter. "Wendy, if you are reading this at Tom's, then your brother got impatient. I love Kevin, but he has always heard the word inheritance louder than the word goodbye. The truck is yours. Not because it is worth much money. Because you know what it meant. Because you learned to drive in it. Because you showed up when I needed rides to chemo. Because you never once asked what you would get when I was gone. Tom has the keys until you bring him the paperwork from Mr. Hayes. Do not let Kevin sell it before the funeral. Do not let him tell you grief makes you sentimental. Some things are worth keeping exactly because the world thinks they are not valuable. Love. Dad." I read the last line twice. "Some things are worth keeping exactly because the world thinks they are not valuable," Kevin said. "That's not legally binding." I looked up slowly. "No, but it is, Dad." Tom placed the keys on the counter in front of him, not in front of Kevin. Then he said, "And until the estate attorney confirms otherwise, this truck is not leaving my shop." Kevin's buyer was waiting in the parking lot. A man in a gray SUV, engine running, watching through the rain. My father's funeral was the next day, and my brother had arrived early to turn memory into cash. This is that story. Before I tell you how my brother learned that selling a dead man's truck before his funeral is harder when the mechanic remembers the last instructions, tell me where you are watching or listening from, and what time it is there. I always wonder who hears stories like this while remembering the moment someone tried to turn grief into a transaction. And if you connect with stories about women who were underestimated, betrayed, pushed aside, and quietly took their power back, like and subscribe to Ultimate Revenge. Some women do not fight over keys in a parking lot. Some women let the man with the envelope speak first. I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, a town small enough that people knew your car before they knew your name, and still asked after your grandmother 10 years after she died. My father, Arthur Lawson, owned Lawson Supply for 32 years. It was the kind of hardware store that smelled like sawdust, paint, coffee, and old men arguing about weather. Dad knew where every screw, hinge, socket wrench, and furnace filter lived. He could fix a leaky faucet, rebuild a porch step, sharpen mower blades, and tell when someone needed credit without making them feel ashamed for asking. He was not a rich man, but he was useful in the deepest sense of the word. People called him before they called contractors. They called him when a pipe burst, when a kid needed a part for a science project, when a widow could not start her snowblower, when the church basement flooded, when a storm took down half a fence. And Dad went, usually in the green truck. The symbolic object in this story was that brass fish keychain. I bought it for him at 12 years old, with money I had saved from washing cars at a church fundraiser. It cost $1, maybe less. It was tarnished even then, a tiny brass fish with one eye scratched off and a ring that pinched your fingernail when you tried to open it. Dad acted like I had given him a gold watch. "Well now," he said, clipping it to his truck keys, "this is lucky." "It's ugly," Kevin said. Dad looked at him. "Luck doesn't need to be pretty." He kept it on his keys from that day forward. When I learned to drive, it swung under the ignition while I ground the clutch and nearly cried from frustration. When Dad picked me up from college after my first breakup, it jingled against the dashboard while he let me cry without saying one useless thing. When my daughter Lily was born and her father was nowhere to be found, Dad drove us home from the hospital in that truck because he said every Lawson baby deserved a first ride in something dependable. Dependable. That was Dad's highest compliment. Kevin was 3 years older than me and had never been dependable for long. That does not mean Dad did not love him. He did. Fiercely. Painfully. With the kind of love parents sometimes give the child who keeps slipping because they are afraid if they stop reaching, the child will disappear completely. Kevin was charming as a boy. Fast smile, quick hands, always selling something. Baseball cards, bikes, concert tickets, excuses. He could make adults laugh while breaking rules. Teachers called him bright, but unfocused. Coaches called him talented, but undisciplined. Mom called him misunderstood. Dad called him still learning for far too many years. I was the steady one. That becomes a trap in many families. Kevin forgot. I remembered. Kevin borrowed. I tracked. Kevin lost jobs. I helped Dad with inventory. Kevin crashed cars. I learned to change oil. Kevin needed money. I needed less, because needing less was the only way I knew to keep peace. Our mother died when I was 28. A stroke in her sleep that split Dad open in a quiet way. Kevin came home for the funeral, cried hard, promised to visit more, then left after asking Dad for help with rent. I stayed. Not in Dad's house, but close. I had my own life. A daughter. A job managing accounts for a roofing company. A divorce behind me. Bills. A mortgage. A tired body. But I made room for Dad, because Dad had always made room for everyone else. Wednesday dinners. Doctor appointments. Store paperwork when his eyesight got worse. Later, chemo. Then, hospice. Kevin visited when guilt became louder than convenience. I do not say that with pleasure, it is just true. Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in April, stage 4. The doctor used careful words. Dad listened, nodded, and asked whether he could still drive. The doctor said, "For now." Dad said, "Good. I hate being chauffeured by people who brake too much." He looked at me when he said it. I said, "I brake appropriately." He said, "That's what people who brake too much say." Even then he made jokes for us because he thought it was his job to make dying easier for the living. Chemo was brutal. Dad lost weight quickly. His hands shook. His appetite changed. He hated the metallic taste in his mouth. He hated people asking how he felt. He hated needing help with buttons. He hated the pitying tilt of heads at church. But he did not hate the truck. He kept it washed, kept the service records in a folder, kept peppermint gum in the cup holder. When he became too weak to drive, he still asked me to start it every few days. "Engines don't like neglect," he said. "Neither do people," I wanted to answer. But I did not. Kevin came in July, stayed 2 days, and told Dad he should sell the truck, while used vehicle prices were still decent. Dad was in his recliner, thin under a flannel blanket, oxygen tubing under his nose. He looked at Kevin for a long moment. "I'm not dead yet." Kevin flushed. "I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" "I mean it's just sitting there. Could help with expenses." Dad's eyes moved to me. I looked away. He knew. I knew. Kevin had not asked about medical bills. He had asked about cash. Dad said, "The truck is not for sale." Kevin leaned back. "Fine. Sorry I brought it up." Dad said, "No, you're sorry I didn't agree." The room went quiet. Kevin left early the next morning. After that, Dad began making arrangements. Not dramatically. Not in one big family meeting. Dad hated big family meetings because Kevin treated them like negotiations. He met with Mr. Robert Hayes, the estate attorney who had handled Mom's probate. He updated his will. He wrote lists. He labeled tools. He gave me passwords. He wrote notes for Lily. He told the pastor which hymns he wanted at the funeral and which ones he did not, because some of them sound like dying twice. He also took the truck to Tom Miller. I drove behind him because he insisted on driving himself one last time. It was early September. The leaves had just started turning at the edges. Dad moved slowly, but when he climbed into that truck his face changed. For 20 minutes, he was not only a sick man. He was Arthur Lawson behind the wheel of his green Ford, left hand on the steering wheel, right hand resting on the gear shift like it belonged there. At Miller's, Tom came out before we parked. He knew, men like Tom and Dad do not need many words. Dad handed him the keys. "Keep it here." Tom looked at him. "For repair?" "For protection." Tom glanced at me. I frowned. Dad said, "Not from Wendy." Tom took the keys. "All right." Dad opened the glove box, removed the service folder, and handed Tom a manila envelope. "If Kevin comes first, call Wendy." Tom nodded. No lecture, no surprise, just loyalty. On the drive home in my car, I said, "Dad, what was that?" He looked out the window. Insurance. Against Kevin? Against impatience. I gripped the steering wheel. You don't have to leave me the truck. I know. You should decide based on what's fair. I am. Kevin will be awful. Dad smiled faintly. That boy has been awful in installments for 49 years. We'll survive one more invoice. I laughed because he wanted me to, then cried in the grocery store parking lot because grief arrives wherever it wants. Dad declined quickly in October. The last week was mostly morphine, whispers, and long stretches of sleep. Kevin came on the second to last day after I told him, "If you want to see him, come now." He came, he cried. I will not say he did not love Dad, he did. But loving someone and honoring them are not the same skill. Dad died at 3:05 on a Sunday morning. I was holding his hand. Kevin was asleep in the recliner. Lily was curled in a chair at the foot of the bed. She was 19 by then, old enough to understand, young enough for it to change her. Dad's last clear words had been the night before. He looked at me and whispered, "Don't let him rush goodbye." I knew who he meant. I won't. Truck 2. I know. Fish key. I smiled through tears. Yes, Dad. He squeezed my hand. Then he was gone before sunrise. Funeral planning is a strange cruelty. Your body wants to collapse, but forms need signatures. Flowers need choosing. Dates need coordinating. Obituaries need names spelled correctly. People want times, addresses, meal preferences, photo slideshows, donation links. Death creates paperwork faster than grief creates breath. Kevin lasted about 12 hours before asking about estate assets. We were sitting at Dad's kitchen table. Casseroles covered the counter. Lily was upstairs resting. I had the funeral home folder open. Kevin said, "Do you know where the truck is?" I looked up. At Miller's. Why? Dad left it there. For repair? No. Kevin tapped his fingers on the table. It's probably worth something. I stared at him. Dad died this morning. I know that. Do you? His face hardened. Don't do that. I'm thinking practically. No, you're thinking early. He stood. Somebody has to. I went back to the funeral papers. He called twice the next day, asking whether I had spoken to Mr. Hayes. Then he texted, "We should liquidate non-essential assets before storage fees pile up." Storage fees. Dad's body was not yet buried, and Kevin had invented storage fees for the truck. I ignored him. That was my mistake. I should have called Tom then. But grief makes even predictable cruelty feel exhausting to prevent. Kevin went to Miller's the morning before the funeral with a copy of an old title Dad had kept in a file cabinet. He had no authority, no executor paperwork, no signed transfer, no estate appointment, just confidence, impatience, and a buyer from 2 towns over willing to pay cash for an old truck if the seller sounded certain enough. Tom saw him coming. Later, Tom told me Kevin walked in smiling too wide. "Morning, Tom. I'm here for Dad's truck." Tom asked, "Wendy with you?" "Why would Wendy be with me?" "Your dad said Wendy handles the truck." Kevin laughed. Dad said a lot of things at the end. Tom did not move. That was the wrong thing for Kevin to say. Tom had watched Dad decline, had seen him thin, tired, but clear, had heard his final instructions without the selfish filter family sometimes applies to dying people. Kevin placed the folded title copy on the counter. "I've got a buyer. Estate needs cash, let's not make this sentimental." Tom said, "I'm calling Wendy." Kevin said, "No, you're not." Tom said, "I already am." That was why I was there when the manila envelope came out. After I read Dad's letter, Kevin paced near the counter. This is manipulation. I folded the paper slowly. Dad writing instructions about his own truck? He knew you'd get emotional. I am emotional. That doesn't make you right. Kevin pointed at Tom. He has no legal right to hold it. Tom leaned both hands on the counter. Then bring the estate attorney. I don't need an attorney. Yes, Tom said. You do. The buyer from the gray SUV walked in then, shaking rain off his jacket. "Everything all right?" Kevin turned quickly. "Yeah, family paperwork issue." I looked at the buyer. "This truck is not for sale." The man's eyebrows rose. Kevin snapped, "Wendy." I ignored him. "My father died 5 days ago. His funeral is tomorrow. My brother does not have authority to sell the truck." The buyer looked at Kevin. Kevin said, "It's complicated." The buyer said, "Sounds simple to me." Then he walked out. I almost liked him. Kevin watched the gray SUV pull away from the shop. "You happy?" "No." "You just cost the estate money." "No, Kevin. You almost cost Dad his dignity." His face twisted. "Don't make this noble. It's an old truck." I held up Dad's letter. "Not to him." Kevin stepped closer. "You think because you drove him to appointments everything belongs to you now?" There it was. The resentment under the greed. I said, "No. I think because Dad made choices, we should honor them. You always were the favorite." That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was so absurd. "Kevin, Dad spent half his life rescuing you." His face went red. Tom said, "Enough." Kevin looked at him. "This is family business." Tom's voice turned hard. "Arthur Lawson was my friend. You came into my shop the day before his funeral trying to sell the truck he told me to protect. You made it my business." Kevin stared at him. No one in town spoke to Kevin that directly anymore. Too many people had learned it was easier to avoid him. Tom had not. I took the keys from the counter, only after Tom nodded. Not because I needed them immediately. Because Dad's brass fish was there, and I needed to feel one thing still where it belonged. Kevin stormed out. The bell on the door rang tiredly behind him. Tom looked at me. "You okay?" "No." "Good. That would be weird." I laughed through tears. He handed me a tissue from a box that had probably been on that counter since the Clinton administration. "Your dad was clear," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." "I won't." "You talked to Mr. Hayes before moving the truck." "I will." "And Wendy?" "Yes." Tom's voice softened. "He loved that you loved the things no one else priced." That broke me. I stood in Miller's Auto Repair, holding my father's keys, and cried until the rain outside became blurry. I need to pause here for a second. If you have ever watched someone start dividing, pricing, claiming, or selling, before grief even had time to sit down, you know what Wendy felt in that repair shop. It was not about the market value of a truck. It was about whether goodbye gets to happen before greed starts clearing the driveway. If this story is hitting close to home, leave a comment and tell me what object in your family meant more than money. And if you have not already, subscribe to Ultimate Revenge. The quiet part is over. The funeral was the next morning. Kevin came late, of course. He arrived 10 minutes before the service in a dark suit that still had the sleeve tag attached. Lily noticed before I did, and quietly pulled it off when he hugged her. That was my daughter. Kind even when people did not earn it. The church was full. Fuller than Kevin expected. People from the hardware store years. Neighbors. Former customers. Church members. Men whose snowblowers Dad had fixed for free. Women he had walked to their cars after evening Bible study. Kids, now grown, who had once come into Lawson's Supply for school project supplies and left with extra screws. Dad slipped into paper bags because science needs spares. Tom Miller sat 3 rows behind us, hands folded, wearing his good jacket. Mr. Hayes, the attorney, sat near the back. That surprised me. Dad had apparently invited half the town into his final instructions. The pastor spoke beautifully. Not too polished. Dad hated polished grief. He said too much shine made things slippery. Lily read a poem. I gave the eulogy. Kevin declined to speak, which was probably his wisest decision of the week. I talked about Dad teaching me to drive stick. About the hardware store. About the green truck. About the time he delivered a generator to Mrs. Alvarez during an ice storm and refused payment but accepted tamales 3 days later because he said refusing food was bad manners. People laughed. I said my father believed value was not always the same as price. He taught me that something old could be useful, something worn could be loved, and something ordinary could hold a whole life if you paid attention. Tom looked down. Kevin stared straight ahead. After the burial, we gathered in the church hall. Casseroles, coffee, paper plates. The rituals that keep grieving people from floating away. Kevin cornered me near the dessert table. "We need to talk." "Not today." "Yes, today. You embarrassed me yesterday." I looked at him. "You embarrassed yourself. You made me look like I was stealing. You were trying to sell something you had no authority to sell." His voice dropped. "I had a copy of the title." "Dad was dead 5 days, Kevin. You had a copy of shame." His eyes flashed. Before he could answer, Mr. Hayes appeared beside us. "Wendy," he said, "when you have a moment, I'd like to schedule the estate meeting." Kevin straightened. "Good. Maybe you can clear this up." "Dad's truck." Mr. Hayes looked at him calmly. "Yes, the truck is specifically addressed." Kevin blinked. "In the will?" "And in a personal property memorandum." I did not know that. Dad had not told me everything. Mr. Hayes continued. "Arthur left the truck to Wendy. He also left instructions that it not be moved from Miller's auto repair until after the funeral and until I confirmed transfer documents." Kevin's face hardened. "That memo was written when?" "Signed and witnessed 6 weeks ago." "He was sick. He was competent." Kevin said, "You can't know that." Mr. Hayes looked at him over his glasses. "I am an estate attorney, Mr. Lawson. Assessing capacity is not a hobby." I almost smiled. Kevin did not. Mr. Hayes lowered his voice. "Your father provided for you in the estate. Generously. I recommend you not begin your role as beneficiary by attempting to sell property he specifically left to your sister before his service has concluded." Kevin looked around. People were watching. Not openly, small town watching, the most powerful kind. He stepped back. "This isn't over." Mr. Hayes said, "Legally, it mostly is." Beautiful. The estate meeting happened the following week. Dad's house felt strange without funeral flowers. Quieter. Less invaded. Mr. Hayes gathered Kevin and me at the kitchen table because Dad had requested the first reading happen at home, not in an office. Dad's will was fair. More fair than Kevin deserved, and less equal than he expected. The house would be sold. Proceeds split between Kevin and me after debts and expenses. Dad's modest savings divided equally. Tools divided by list. Personal items assigned carefully. A college fund for Lily from a small investment account Dad had hidden from everyone, including me. The green truck to Wendy. The fishing gear to Kevin, because despite everything, Dad remembered the good version of his son, the boy who once woke before dawn to sit beside him at the lake. Kevin looked emotional when he heard that. Then defensive, as if emotion embarrassed him. Mr. Hayes read Dad's letter to both of us. "Kevin and Wendy, do not turn my death into a yard sale. I know there are bills. I know there are things to sort. I know grief makes some people sentimental and others practical, because practical feels safer than sad. But I am asking you both to slow down. Kevin, you are my son. I love you. I have helped you many times, sometimes more than I should have. I am leaving you what I believe is fair. Do not take what is not yours because waiting feels like losing. Wendy, you have carried more than I asked and more than your brother noticed. Do not let responsibility become silence. Speak when something matters. The truck goes to Wendy. Not because I love Kevin less, because Wendy knows how to keep a thing without needing to turn it into cash. Try to be kind after I'm gone. If you cannot be kind, at least be honest. Dad." Kevin stared at the table. For once, he had no joke, no argument, no quick escape. Mr. Hayes folded the letter. "The estate process will follow the will." Kevin said quietly, "He thought I'd steal." I answered before I could stop myself. "He thought you'd rush." Kevin looked at me. "That's not better." "No," I said, "but it's more accurate." He pushed back from the table and walked outside. I found him 10 minutes later on the back porch. He was sitting on the steps, shoulders hunched, looking at the empty driveway where the truck used to sit before Dad left it at Miller's. "I needed money," he said. There it was. Not an excuse. Not yet. A truth. "For what?" He rubbed his hands together. "Debt." "What kind?" "Credit cards, some business stuff." "Kevin." "I know." "How much?" He shook his head. Too much. I sat on the step above him. Rain had stopped, but the air still smelled wet. Were you going to tell me? No. Were you going to tell Dad if he were alive? He laughed bitterly. Dad knew everything eventually. That's not an answer. No, I wasn't. He looked at his shoes. I saw the truck sitting there and thought, nobody needs it. You have a car. I have bills. Dad's gone. It's metal. Then why didn't you wait until after the funeral? He was quiet, then whispered, because I knew you'd stop me. At least that was honest. Yes. He looked at me. I hated that Dad trusted you with everything. He didn't trust me with everything. He trusted me with the things you were likely to rush. His mouth tightened. I hated that too. I let the silence sit, then said, Kevin, Dad loved you. I know. But he didn't trust your urgency. His eyes filled. That's a nice way to say he didn't trust me. No, it's a precise way to say what happened. He wiped his face angrily. He left me fishing rods. Yes, I haven't fished in years. He remembered when you did. That broke something in him. He cried then, not loudly, not performatively, like a man who had mistaken inheritance for proof of love, and then found love in an old tackle box instead. I did not comfort him too quickly. He needed to feel it. We both did. The truck stayed at Miller's for 2 more weeks while paperwork moved. I visited it twice. The first time, I just sat behind the wheel. The cab smelled like Dad. Peppermint gum still in the cup holder. A faded hardware store receipt tucked above the visor. Work gloves on the passenger seat. The brass fish hanging from the keys in my hand. I put my forehead on the steering wheel and sobbed. Not because I wanted the truck, because I wanted Dad to open the shop door and say, well, don't flood the floorboards, Wendy. Tom gave me privacy. When I came out, he handed me a small box. Found this under the seat. Inside were small things. A pocket knife. 2 quarters. A receipt from a diner Dad liked. A photo of Lily at age 6, holding a fish with both hands and looking horrified. And a folded note. Wendy, if Tom finds this before I remember to tell you, remind him his coffee is terrible. I laughed through tears. Tom shouted from the bay, I heard that. Good. The second time Lily came with me. She climbed into the passenger seat and ran her hand over the cracked dashboard. Grandpa let me steer once, she said. I know. I was in the back seat pretending not to panic. She smiled. Uncle Kevin really tried to sell it? Yes. That's awful. Yes. Are you going to keep it? I looked at the truck. I think so. Can you drive it? Yes. Can you teach me? My throat tightened. Dad had left the truck to me, but maybe he had also left me a way to pass him forward. Yes, I said, but you're going to stall. She laughed. Probably. Machines don't like panic. She looked at me. Grandpa said that? Many times. Then I'll learn. The public payoff came accidentally, as the best ones often do. 2 months after the funeral, Kevin tried to tell a softer version of the story at a family gathering. Christmas at Aunt Marlene's house. He had been avoiding me, making payments toward his debts after Dad's estate funds came through, acting civil but wounded. I was willing to leave it alone. Truly, not everything needs a speech. But Kevin needed to rewrite. Someone asked about the truck because I had driven it there. Kevin laughed and said, yeah, Wendy got sentimental, so Dad's old truck is still kicking. I almost sold it, but you know how she is. You know how she is. That small phrase. The family chuckled lightly, unsure. I set down my coffee. Aunt Marlene looked at me. Tom Miller was there too, because his wife was Aunt Marlene's bridge partner, and small towns are braided beyond reason. Tom turned from the snack table. Almost sold it? He said. Kevin froze. Tom wiped his hands on a napkin. That's not quite how I remember it. I almost whispered, Tom, no, but I did not. Because Dad's letter had said, speak when something matters. Tom continued, calm as sunrise. You came to my shop the morning before your father's funeral, with a buyer waiting in the parking lot. Arthur had left me written instructions not to release the truck to anyone but Wendy after attorney confirmation. That's why the truck is still with the person he wanted to have it. The room went silent. Kevin's face burned red. Aunt Marlene looked horrified. Before the funeral? Kevin muttered, "It wasn't like that." Tom said, "It was exactly like that." No one laughed now. I looked at Kevin. He looked away. The old family pattern would have required me to soften the moment. To say, it was stressful. To rescue him from the consequence of being accurately described. I did not. Instead, I said, "Dad asked us not to turn his death into a yard sale." Aunt Marlene pressed a hand to her chest. "Oh, Arthur." Kevin left early. I let him. Later that night, he texted, "You didn't have to let Tom humiliate me." I replied, "You didn't have to lie." He wrote, "I wasn't lying. I was simplifying." I replied, "Truth does not need your editing." No response. That might have been the end of us. For a while it felt like it was. January passed, then February. Kevin made no effort. I did not chase him. Lily and I worked on the truck with Tom's help. New belts, brake work, tune-up, fresh tires, deep cleaning. Not restoration to showroom condition. Dad would have hated that. He believed old things should still look like they had done something. On the first warm Saturday in March, I taught Lily to drive stick in the high school parking lot. She stalled 12 times. On the 13th, the truck jerked forward and kept going. She screamed. I laughed so hard I cried. The brass fish swung under the ignition. For a moment, Dad was everywhere. Kevin showed up at Miller's in April. Tom called me first. "Your brother's here." My stomach tightened. About the truck? No. Says he wants to talk to me. That surprised me. Later, Tom told me Kevin apologized. Awkwardly, badly at first, then better. He said he had been ashamed, that he needed money, that seeing the truck made him think of bills before Dad, that he hated himself for it and hated me because I made it harder to pretend. Tom listened, then said, "Apologize to Wendy. I'm not the one whose father's letter you called manipulation." Kevin came to my house the next day. I almost did not let him in. Then I did, because Dad had asked for honest if we could not be kind. Kevin stood in my kitchen holding an envelope. "I'm not here to fight." "Good." He looked thinner, tired, less certain. "I sold Dad's fishing gear." My chest tightened. He held up a hand. "Not all, just some duplicate reels. Mr. Hayes said I could. I kept the rods Dad listed. I sold enough to make a debt payment." "Okay." "I wanted to tell you before you heard it from someone else." That was new. I nodded. "Thank you." He placed the envelope on the table. "What's that?" "Copy of my debt repayment plan. Not because you asked. Because I'm trying to stop hiding everything." I did not touch it. "Kevin, I know, you're not my mother." "No. But you're the person Dad trusted to tell the truth." That landed. He sat across from me. "I'm sorry," he said. I waited. "For what specifically?" He gave a tired half smile. "You and your specifics." "Yes." He took a breath. "I'm sorry for going to Miller's before the funeral to sell the truck. I'm sorry for bringing a buyer. I'm sorry for using a title copy like it gave me authority. I'm sorry for calling Dad's letter manipulation. I'm sorry for making you defend his wishes when you were trying to bury him." That was the apology. The real one. I felt it move through me. "Thank you." His eyes reddened. I was scared and broke and ashamed. But that doesn't make it okay. No, it doesn't. I know. Do you? He looked at the table. I'm starting to. That was honest enough. We did not hug, not then. Some apologies need to stand without reward. But when he left, I watched through the window as he paused by the green truck in my driveway. He touched the hood. Just once. Then walked away. That summer, Lily, Kevin, and I drove the truck to the lake Dad loved. It was my idea, though I almost regretted it immediately. Kevin was quiet in the passenger seat. Lily sat between us because the old bench seat allowed it, and she said it made the truck feel like a time machine. She was right. We brought Dad's old tackle box. Kevin opened it slowly, like something might break. Inside were lures, hooks, line, a rusted pair of pliers, and a folded fishing license from 10 years earlier. Dad had labeled one tray Kevin's favorites in black marker. Kevin stared at it. He kept these? Yes. I was 16 when I used that lure. I know. He laughed softly. I caught nothing. Dad said you caught a sunburn. Kevin cried then, sitting by the lake with the tackle box open. This time, I put a hand on his shoulder. Not because everything was fine. Because grief finally looked like grief instead of inventory. We scattered a small portion of Dad's ashes near the dock that day. Most were buried beside Mom, as he wanted, but he had asked for a little to go to the lake. Kevin said, "I'm sorry I rushed goodbye." I said, "Me too." Lily held the brass fish keychain while we stood there. Afterward, I let Kevin drive the truck back to town. He asked first. That mattered. Can I? I looked at him. No buyer waiting? He winced. I deserved that. Yes. I handed him the keys. Careful with the clutch. He smiled sadly. Machines don't like panic. We drove home with the windows down. For the first time since Dad died, the truck did not feel like contested property. It felt like memory in motion. The final lesson is not that old trucks should never be sold. Sometimes they must be. Bills are real. Estates are complicated. Objects can become burdens, and grief does not pay taxes. But timing reveals the heart. There is a difference between settling an estate and rating goodbye. There is a difference between practical and impatient. There is a difference between an old truck and the last place your father felt like himself. My brother tried to sell Dad's truck before the funeral. The mechanic refused to hand him the keys, and because Dad had trusted a friend with one envelope, one spare key, and one final instruction, Kevin did not get to turn the green Ford into cash before we had even sung the last hymn. Dad was right. Some things are worth keeping, exactly, because the world thinks they are not valuable. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I know some of you have watched relatives start grabbing, pricing, selling, or rewriting before the funeral flowers even wilted. If Wendy's story reached you, I hope you remember that grief deserves time before inventory, and love sometimes lives in ordinary things. Keys, trucks, tools, letters, old sweaters, cracked dashboards, ugly brass fish. Keep the instructions, keep the witnesses, keep your calm. And when someone tries to rush goodbye for cash, let the person your loved one trusted hold the keys. Subscribe to Ultimate Revenge for more stories about quiet women, family betrayal, silent comebacks, and the moment one envelope stops the sale. So tell me, if your brother tried to sell your father's truck before the funeral and the mechanic had your dad's final instructions, would you let the sale go through to keep peace? Or would you take the keys and protect what your father asked you to keep?